I know it's a little daunting to have Tim in here. He stresses me out anyway. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. We are now live and ready to go. We're not yet recording. Don't worry. As always, I'm going to do our quick tutorial for the audience before we actually start recording. So this is a about 45-minute podcast recording. Welcome, everybody. So happy to have you here in the new year for a very first episode of 2026. As we move through this episode, this is about a 45-minute conversation with Matt Dalio here. During the first half of that conversation, Tim and I will be talking one-on-one with Matt about his area of expertise. And then in the second half of the episode, all of you are welcome to ask questions of Matt live. To ask your own questions, do me a favor and open up the chat on Discord and type out a question like this. And then mark that question for me with a Q emoji so that I can see that it's a question. And if you like that question, you can hit that Q emoji yourself to indicate you would also like that question answered. In general, we give preference to the questions with higher numbers of Qs and the questions that were asked first. So the earlier you ask your questions, the more likely you are to get some Matt goodness. If you're on the other streaming platforms, hello and welcome. You can just drop your questions in the chat. For the most part, I can parse those well. Okay, I think that's it. Tim, am I right? Can we start recording?
Sounds good to me.
All right, cool. Let me get the bot started and the soundboard. You got your script up, Tim, ready to go?
I have indeed.
All right, let's do this thing. You feeling ready, Matt? All good? Any questions before we start recording?
As ready as I'll ever be.
All right, let's do this thing. Welcome, indie game developers, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour, the first episode of 2026 and the best dang indie game podcast on the planet.
Today, we're being joined by Matt Dalio, CEO and founder of Endless, to talk about Gamified Learning Lessons, how building games teaches strategy, teamwork, feedback cycles, and storytelling.
Wow. Oh, no, I forgot. Okay, damn. It wouldn't be the show without having to do the intro a second time. We forgot the soundboard.
Game lunch hour.
Second time's the charm. I actually forgot to tell you something anyway here, Matt. We've taken 2 weeks off, so perhaps we're rusty. The way that you know that our intro has finished and that's your time to shine is when we ask you what you're having for lunch. Good?
Perfect.
All right, one more time. Here we go. Welcome, indie game developers, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour and the very first episode of our show in 2026. This is the best dang indie game podcast on the planet.
Today, we're being joined by Matt Dalio, CEO and founder of Endless, to talk about Gamified Learning Lessons, how building games teaches strategy, teamwork, feedback cycles, and storytelling.
Nice.
Indie Game Lunch Hour.
I missed that jingle. All right, in our live magical podcast, we give listeners the chance to hear real stories from real indie game developers, as well as directly ask them questions in the second half of each episode.
This is a recording of a weekly event we host in the Indie Game Academy Discord on Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, so feel free to swing by for the next one.
We're your hosts, Willem Delventhal, the headmaster here at IGA, and the Wizard of Games.
And I'm Tim Wood, founder of Right Finder Headhunting and the Knight of Games Recruitment. And joining us today is Matt.
Hello, Matt. Welcome to the show. We're so excited to have you here. And as our very first guest in 2026, I am very excited to talk about gamified lessons. It's actually the space that I myself got started in game development. I am very curious, Matt, before anything else, as always, what are you having for lunch today, my friend?
So my wife and I are in Uruguay right now. My wife is Argentine, and we yesterday had a giant asado with like 25 people, and so I'm having some leftover dried up meat that was quite tasty.
Nice. That's awesome. I forget exactly what it's called. There's a similar tradition in the Philippines where they make a long table full of much food, and I was part of those exactly once. I'm a vegetarian. They were nice enough to make me this tiny pile of vegetables at the end of the table while everybody else was tucking into the meat. It was quite an experience. It's pretty awesome.
We did have a potato thrown in there, so
One or two.
did
Good.
finish home. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, welcome to the show, Matt. As we said, this is our first episode in 2026. It's fantastic to have you here. Matt here is the founder and CEO at Endless, which is we will let you introduce it and talk about it yourself. But before we even do that, as always, we like to start with the origin story. So, Matt, I'd love to know where you are in games today and how you got there.
Yeah, so I came at games from a very different perspective, and I think that most people in games have come at it from. I'll give my long story short. Is I lived in China for a year when I was 11 years old with a Chinese family. My parents were in the U.S. I started a foundation working with orphanages and orphans in China when I was 16 years old, and so a lot of my life was spent kind of in emerging markets trying to help kids. Fast forward a long chapter, I went to Stanford Business School, and at that time I was kind of excited about the power of technology to make a huge impact on the global stage. Yet, and there was this smartphone revolution that was happening. This was 2010. And it just felt like everything was being invented around me, Instagram and Snapchat and Uber. And then I went on a trip to India, and I realized that smartphones were about to sweep across emerging markets, and they would change the world. Billions of people. I went around, I felt like, everyone shouting, billions of people are about to get these things. Their lives are about to be changed. But the giant question was, would they get the tools that we use to work, which is a computer? The way I often describe it is, if we all threw away our computers, most people wouldn't have their job after a couple of weeks, and most people wouldn't be able to study to get a job. And so there was this kind of revolution that was destiny, and then there was this other thing that is the great equalizer, which is called a laptop, that was kind of almost a shunned object at the time because people thought it was going to die. So very long story short, I have spent about 15 years of my life trying to democratize access to that little tool, laptop. And a very long story short, 15 years made short, is if you, with many interludes of mistaken pathways, we thought you make a cheap device and use an ARM processor to make a computer as cheap as a smartphone. What we realized was that it's actually financing that is the magical thing. So long story short, you can make financing available to people who normally wouldn't get bank loans. We would throw events with literally 3,000 parents for their kids, and 1,000 of them would sign the bank loan immediately to buy the laptop, and the bank would reject 90% of them. And what we realized is that in Africa, they had the exact same problem for solar panels, and they solved it by this thing called pay-as-you-go financing. Basically, the device unlocks when you pay, and all of a sudden, magically, people pay. And then there's a whole internet connectivity thing that I won't let myself get passionate about and distracted by. But I will say that in the process of deploying these laptops into kids' hands, we were always thinking to ourselves, well, once they get the tool, now you have to teach them the skill to then get them the job. So how do you teach them these, globally employable skills where, a kid in a remote village can go get a job? And, the extreme example of that is code, right? If you can code, you can be part of that global workforce. And I had two surprising insights. One was I didn't expect it, but when I was interviewing most of our engineers, these kind of absolute genius guru Linux engineers from the Linux community that we were hiring, I asked them all just out of curiosity how they got their start. The similar, kind of question that you just asked me, where did you get your start? And almost all of them gave the same answer. And it was just this weird repetition of the exact same answer.
I think I might know what it is. Yes.
That's right. And to this day, when I tell an engineer that, most of the time I hear, oh, that's how I learned. I loved games. I discovered I could hack them. I discovered that, I could build them. It was more fun to hack them or build them than it was to play them. And, and then that got me started. And then I, began a journey that took me down many other paths. And so that was the first insight. The kind of very much related insight to that was whenever we would put these laptops in kids' hands, in emerging markets, we had these kind of honestly not great Linux games, math games, were Math Blaster, but the cheap open source version of it. And I would walk into classrooms full of kids shouting their multiplication tables at each other, which is complete utter delight. You would walk in and just all you would hear was just the squealing of numbers. And so it just became so obvious, like, wow, in some sense, the number one challenge of education is to engage, is to get them to want to do it, because when they want to do it, they do it. And when they do it, they learn. And if games are so good at engaging, then, why is it that we systematically don't use them more effectively? And if so many of today's engineers, Elon Musk learned to code when he was a kid, through games. Mark Zuckerberg was the exact same story. Both of them say that most of their best engineers learn this way. If that's how all of these people got started, why aren't we systematically doing that to teach people how to build software in a modern world? And I want to make sure that I make really clear, when I say build software, I do not mean code, I do not mean syntax, I mean the process of making software across all of the disciplines, whether you're the designer, the product manager, the project manager, the marketer, the digital artist, or of course there are engineers in the midst of that. All of those skills are being upended by AI and enabled by AI. So in a world where like the whole workforce is changing so dramatically, it's like, okay, schools are the exact same thing they've always been. We know that, that's a constant complaint. And yet with AI here, it's like, for the first time in American history, there are more people not wanting to go to college than wanting to go to college, because they see that they're going to be saddled with student debt. They see that the jobs, are changing, that the skills that they're learning in school are not relevant for that workforce. And so this aspirational thing that used to lift people up, it was the number one driver of social mobility, to this day it still is something that no longer is aspirational for very, very good reasons. And so that's the state of education. And there are 3 billion kids on the planet, kids in air quotes, under the age of 25 years old. There are 3 billion of them. And the problem statement of humanity is that we have to make sure that they have a job in a world of AI. And the school systems that are supposed to solve that problem do not know how to do the thing. In other words, they're banning ChatGPT. They've never been part of startups. They don't know how tech is built. They ban the thing rather than embrace the thing. And so the system that's supposed to solve that problem doesn't know how to solve the problem. They know they don't know how to solve that problem. And they're looking for solutions. Parents are looking for solutions and kids are looking for solutions. And the question then is, what is that solution? And so we think that games are certainly a huge part of it. I'm going to add one last other piece, and then just at risk of rambling for too long, but it's so central to how we think about things. It's the second pillar I mentioned. And it's the power of GitHub. It's the power of community. It's the power of putting people together to make things together and have them learn from each other, that I think is so underused in education. If I look at the learning journey of these kind of amazing Linux gurus, they got started with games, but then they built a multi-year journey, literally in like the Linux kernel in GitHub. GitHub was their school. And when I say GitHub was their school, in some cases, I mean it quite literally. The best engineer we ever hired, we stole away from Red Hat. He was quantitatively, objectively, if you look at the Linux GNOME desktop stack, you could see he was by far the number one by like an order of 2 or 3-fold. And he didn't have a high school diploma. Meanwhile, we were hiring a bunch of like Stanford CS grads, super smart, top of class. And it was like hiring interns compared to hiring quite literally the person who could go into like the depths of the graphics stack, because he had spent 8 years in that kernel while the others were in high school and college. And so literally like Linux and GitHub was his school. And so in some sense, I see GitHub, if you define school as a place that you go to learn to do a job, GitHub is basically the largest school in the world. There are 100 million people who are all getting better at the job that they do by being inside of that. And it costs nothing to join it. It is a school that is free. And so when you converge those two things of like the power of collectively built projects where there are advanced people, there are novices, they're all working together in the same space, they're all learning from each other, they're all building big, bold, ambitious things, which is where as we talk about kind of our vision of game development, is kind of the sweet spot of what I'm hoping we can get into today. But as you converge that with what are kids passionate about? Games. Great. Let's go do that for games. It just seems like such a natural convergence. And it just seems so surprising that neither of those insights at all really topics of conversation in the mainstream halls of education.
Yeah, yeah. This is a lot of what you're saying, a lot of what you're singing here is stuff that I have run into and that we have run into ourselves. We're in the midst, in terms of just straight up the gaming industry. We're not talking about the larger tech sector of exactly the evolution that you are describing. When I was going to school, and I'm only a couple generations back compared to the people who are going through it right now, of course you went to school and of course you learned to code. At this point in time, after running this space for about 5 years, I can no longer confidently tell people to go to a higher education institution, and I can no longer confidently tell people to even learn to code. I still do for the technical background, but in the midst of this AI evolution, we still don't quite know what making games looks like in a little while. I also actually love that you're talking to people in the larger tech sector just about tech, and you're still having the same stories told that we're having when we talk to our developers, which is, yeah, I played a game, I fell in love with it, I made a game. That's one of my favorite stories, and basically everybody has that story.
And then once you know how to make a game, it's such a beautiful off-ramp into all the other disciplines, because the other, beautiful characteristic of a game is that it is so multidisciplinary. In other words, it's sound design, it's art, it's design, it's, engineering, it's narrative, it's all of these. It's literally every discipline kind of thrown into a box and shaken up. And then because there are simple game making tools, a novice can do it. And then because there are super advanced game making tools, we work with the guy who basically built the Xbox and the HoloLens, and he's like, that was the best team at Microsoft outside of the operating system team. Like, that was the best, and that was where the guru engineers went, because it's kind of like the floor is so low. And by the way, with AI, the floor has been lowered, and then the ceiling is so high. And by the way, with AI, it makes someone, able to raise their ceiling. And so it's such an unbounded space to be able to teach so many things. If I discover I like 3D modeling, and then I discover I like 3D modeling buildings, I may have just discovered I want to be an architect. So it's on so many levels. Actually, the process of making games, not just playing games, but making games, is such a good learning environment.
So with regard to games being that learning environment, there's a couple of people I've spoken to have made games to teach you either various concepts or game making itself. And there's sometimes been a tension between making that game entertaining versus having it teach effectively. So what are some ways you can kind of resolve that? Because I know at times those goals could potentially conflict with each other.
Yeah, my short answer is we gave up on it, and there's a whole longer answer. There was an interlude in the how did we get here story that I should add, which is we started thinking, okay, if everyone packs their games, then let's make a game where there's lots of mini games. And I read Ready Player One before the movie, and everyone was talking about it. And I was like, we're going to make many mini games, and there's a meta narrative, and and we called it a metaverse until people started talking about the metaverse, and then we stopped using that term. But the idea was basically everything's hackable, and it's a game you play. And in the process, we realized that we went through many millions of dollars, and that what we needed was many more millions of dollars than we had to build a game of the quality and the voluminous nature of all the pathways that we would once need. And there was just literally no way we could ever build that. Which gets to kind of one of the core points of your question, which is, how do you build? One of the reasons education games haven't succeeded is because they have no money. One of the reasons they have no money is because they haven't succeeded. It takes a lot of money to build a good game, as we see, GTA's, now $1 billion over budget at a $2 billion total budget. So we realized there was no way we were going to build this game. And then we realized, well, wait, we could actually invite the community in to help us build these levels. And then we realized, wait, they're going to learn more by building a game, sitting in Unity and Blender and, and GitHub with us, and than they'll ever learn by playing any game we build. And then we realized, well, why have them build the game we want to build? Why not have them build an array of games, whether that's, a bunch of collaborative games that we want to build with the community, which we'll get to, or whatever game they want to build. And so the hack, which is not a hack, it's just literally play it on a different field. And the field we play on is make to learn rather than play to learn, precisely because it's so hard to do what you just asked about. It's so hard to find that perfect balance between I'm learning and I'm playing. the chocolate and the broccoli, that never will go well together. Whereas what we do is we just say, you want to build a game? We'll teach you to build a game. And then, they build what they want.
It is a really, I feel like I've gone through a similar journey to you, specifically in this space. I got my start at Lumosity Brain Training Games. That was my very first industry job. And something that became really obvious after 4 years working there is the balance of educational value versus your more traditional like motivational matrix. Like what gets somebody to play a game? And the problem with any educational game in my mind is that those two things often conflict. Making something that is of educational value is hard to also make it as satisfying and fun as a game that has no or very little educational value. And that often you wind up sort of having to pick one of those two objectives. And you can definitely bring in some of the secondary objective, but there still is one that's primary. So I'm curious, in your mind, you're talking largely about the educational value of making a game and not as much about playing a game. But I'm curious, are you still having people or are you still investing in the educational game environment? Or are you like, no, it's just about building games and it doesn't matter that it's for educational purposes?
There are a few things that we are doing in that space. The one thing I'll say is that we are making a game-making tool to make it really easy for people to make games, because we found as soon as we started running programs, we found that no one could use Unity. You spend, the intro Unity course is 18 hours. And so what we did was we built what I consider almost a giant scaffolding tutorialization process for Unity. And so it's, it starts kind of, I can place blocks like Minecraft because, every kid in the world could do that. But then it very systematically scaffolds you into very high levels of capability until it literally takes you into the Unity SDK. And you can now import your own assets or textures or code. It's got a Lua scripting layer inside. And before that, it's got a wiring layer that's really easy. So anyway, so we are doing that. And that tool has been used in a lot of learning environments. We're also doing some similar things on Godot for kids who don't have access to GPUs. So kind of simplifying and scaffolding and tutorializing the whole Godot engine. And so those are, with that said, play experiences, although you can play the games that you make, of course, and we kind of fuse the playing and building almost become intermingled, intertwined. So that's very much central to what we do. We want to use that tool to build. There are two games that I want to build with that, and eventually I do hope that others, the community, will come to and create many learning games. But one game is a language learning game, and then the other game is actually that game that we set out to build many years ago called The Endless Mission, which is a game where everything's hackable. And the beauty of this tool is that it's so easy to make levels. It's so easy to collaborate. It's so easy to build things as teams. It's so easy to string those levels together that it's really easy to make games that are only functional if you have abundance of content. So it's a little bit like, Mario Brothers Wonder had like 186 levels, I think it was. And Super Mario Maker 2 had, I think, 24 million levels. Just such an order of magnitude difference in terms of the volume of content. So when you can lean on a community to help contribute to a core game, that requires voluminous content, like language learning experience, where you're traversing the world and you need lots of gameplay to create lots of engaging opportunities to practice your language, or the coding game where you have lots of secret hidden things and lots of levels where there's Easter eggs everywhere. You need those thousands, if not tens of thousands, of hours of gameplay where the best stuff bubbles up. And so that's really where, if we're focusing on anything in the play to learn space, it's that. But my number one objective in doing that, to be actually really clear, goes back to the power of community. We believe that when you take professionals and you put them into an environment with novices, whether those novices are fourth year college game making students at game making universities, or a high school student, and they can all enter the same environment, the studio without walls, where the entire dev process is done in the open, just like Linux, right? Just like these incredible open source projects that are incredible, learning environments, that if you can build games in the same way, you can now make a learning trajectory for that kid to come in and be like, well, I can make a texture and contribute it. And then I discover I can make a 3D asset and contribute it. And then I discover I can, add a little bit of code with AI that allows me to suddenly make that character come to life in a way that I otherwise couldn't have. And it turns out I actually really like this coding thing. And next thing you know, one day I'm contributing, core levels, core code, core art assets, and doing that in a way that allows me to interact with these incredible professionals who are running it. So our primary motivation in building those learning games is actually to further our core thesis that by building big, aggressive, ambitious, cool projects that can justify hiring professionals to work on them, that intersection of learners and industry, I believe, is where like the most powerful learning for how to enter industry takes place. Almost the equivalent of the internship that 1 million kids can join. In other words, millions of kids can contribute art assets, and maybe they don't all make it into the final game, but they're in it, they're contributing. And so that's the core motivation for us building those games. Beyond that, we don't do really anything in play to learn games.
Super fascinating. Tim, do you have a follow-up here? Anything you want to ask?
Yeah, it's a question that's been kind of boiling on my mind since I've been reading the website. But traditional education is all about kind of standardized testing, measurable outcomes, and that cycle, which people like me did not get on with too well. So
really?
How are you measuring? Yeah, funny that. So how do you measure that your games and your workflows are? I think we've lost him.
We've just lost Matt. Oh, he's back. Hold on. You got scared of your question. It was too strong, too powerful of a question. Hi, Matt.
Come on in.
It's all good. No, so as I was saying, so traditional education routes are all about kind of standardized testing and measuring those outcomes and really kind of rinse and repeating one or two different things. And I'm being very simplistic there. So how are you measuring kind of what your games are teaching and if they're landing with users? Is it in that final product? Are there kind of little quiz elements that people are doing? Like how does that kind of scaffolding work? Because as a recruiter, that sounds really interesting, that I could essentially have a portfolio and kind of track someone's progress. But how are you managing that yourselves?
Yeah, so we stole a couple of concepts from the game industry to do this, and they're really good concepts. The first is badges and XP. In other words, just systematically rewarding and tracking the contributions that people make, which then show how they level up. And the second is the concept of a skill tree. School, there's you pick your subjects and you are all on the same trajectory. It's interesting. I'll say I was speaking with the guy who built. He's actually the current president of Singapore, but he built the education system of Singapore. And I was asking him, like, in your 30 some odd year career in Singapore, Storage has been in everything. What was it you're most proud of? And his answer was very clearly built the education system. And the education system is the #1 education system in the world, year after year. And he was describing immediately what he failed at. He immediately went to describe what he didn't succeed at, and he was describing that they succeeded for the middle 80%, they failed the bottom 10%, and they fail the top 10%. And when I describe the way that games work and the way that we think about, frankly, life working and education working as a skill tree, where you can get better at many different things, and as you get better at those, you can find what you're passionate about, what you're good at, and you can keep getting better at that thing. And that sometimes those skill trees merge, right? Like in Civilization, metallurgy and gunpowder, and now you have cannons that get unlocked at the intersections of these skill trees. That's frankly, that is the way life works, and that we should think about education that way. And his answer literally was, "Oh my God, I think you may have solved the problem." The reason I describe that is because traditional education, even the #1 education system in the world, still thinks in this very linear and rigid way, even though at the end of these skill trees, we end up with something like 10,000 possible jobs that people can end up with, and yet we teach like 5 core subjects. And so if you can create pathways, which is what we are building towards, that allow people to go into it at the base of the skill tree, we look at it and we say there's kind of business and entrepreneurship, marketing, that kind of stuff. There's design, there's art, there's engineering, and there's management. And if you double click into those, that basically represents all the jobs in tech. So let's say I'm an artist. Okay, well then I'm a 3D modeler. Okay, if I'm a 3D modeler, well that's industrial design, architecture, mechanical engineering, automotive. I mean, it's just kind of all these all of these industries are literally physically basically everything around us. And so that notion of now going back to the badges and the points, tracking people's contributions across that skill tree is actually a much better representation of what people are good at. Turns out this isn't just our theory. If you go to GitHub, that is the primary recruiting tool for basically every Silicon Valley startup. They don't care which school you went to. They don't care what your GPA was. If your GitHub profile is not strong, they're not going to hire you. They want to see your portfolio. The same is true for designers. I could get, go to RISD and get a 4.0, but if my portfolio sucks, I'm not getting hired. The inverse is also true, right? I could literally like this, guy who didn't graduate from high school and was, guru at Red Hat. I can literally not go to school, not have any, formal credential, and yet I have the credential that matters, which is I've done the work and I can show I've done the work.
No, I completely agree with you there. I mean, I've been recruiting in games now for 5 years, and I can count on one hand the amount of times I've been asked, about degrees and higher education and stuff. It's literally all, what have they done? What credentials do they have? Can we see their portfolio? They can cut the mustard. Let's have them in the role. And it's really nice coming from that, from other industries where I've had some clients go, we only want people from red brick universities, and you're like, well, how are you being equitable then? It really does level the playing field when you're just looking at the output of work. Willem, do we have some community questions? Oh, sorry.
And I'll just say for a second, I went to one of those red brick universities, and when people graduated, they literally couldn't get a job.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is there's one caveat. They could all get jobs in consulting, investment banking, and finance because they knew that they were taking raw talent, and Google has an entire infrastructure to take raw talent and train them. In other words, they knew that they were going to do the training, and all they were looking for was the smart people who were hardworking. But literally outside of that, I remember looking at job descriptions. I didn't want to go into one of those things. I looked at the job descriptions. I'm like, everyone says 3 to 5 years of work experience required. How am I supposed to get 3 to 5 years of work experience if no one's willing to hire me?
Welcome to the modern economy. It's so much of what you're saying is things that I have felt myself and that we have discovered here as well, specifically with these indie and junior game developers. That's the people that we serve and the people we work with. There are one of those core problems that we hear time and time again is exactly what you just said. Junior roles are fewer and further between, in part because of AI. And in part because of our own industry strife over the past couple of years. And those indie jobs those junior jobs, tend to require exactly that. We want to see 3-shift games. We want to see 3 years of experience. We want to see 5 years of experience for you to come and, do the most base level work here. And in some ways, because this is a creative field, that's a reasonable expectation, at least the launched games. I kind of get confused by people who leave school and have not yet launched a game. Isn't that the whole point? Why haven't you done that yet? But besides that pressure to release and to launch, it does feel like it isn't a higher education is an antiquated system, at least here in the gaming industry. And I think in a larger space, because it builds these rigid structures that just naturally can't keep up with a pretty rapidly changing world and workforce. I'm also, by the way, extremely jealous of your skill tree thing. This is something I pitched to my team a long time ago, and we decided that we couldn't build because we didn't have the resources. So I think we're enemies now, maybe mortal enemies, Matt.
No, let's work together.
All right, okay, I guess so.
We like partnering.
That's great, though. So yes, I think
Could I, before we move on, could I just ask you about the kind of I want to interview you for a minute just to kind of ask about the core thesis that we're chasing, and it really is hypothesis. We've done a lot of, we know that games can teach. We know building games can teach. We've done a lot of that. We know that. But the core thing actually is on the studio side.
Yeah.
And my hypothesis is it's hard to raise money out there for a game these days. And yet, the creativity often is ironically in the hands of the same people who it's hard to raise money for.
Yeah.
And that money is largely used to hire people. I need, engineers, designers, artists, etc.
Yeah.
And so one other way of getting those same human resources is to basically modularize it and treat it like open source software. Now, I'm going to put a giant caveat. When I say open source software, I do not mean the license. I mean the process and the methodology of inviting people in to contribute, of blurring the lines between you are just a consumer of what I've built, and you're someone who's now actually able to help contribute.
Yeah.
And maybe I pay you. Maybe it's for college credit, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, like on the students that you work with and in the game studios that you work with. What do you think the appetite of those two working together would be? In other words, the studios being like, come help us contribute, and the students being like, yay, we get that portfolio and that experience and that mentorship, pay for it. What are your thoughts on that intersection of the almost barter economy in there?
Yeah. It is. I have many thoughts about this. This is in some ways the problem that we're trying to solve and that we talk about daily as well. There is a movement that's happening right now that is more or less volunteer or free positions for brand new indie studios. The number of indie studios that was founded in 2025 was 6 times the number founded in 2024. And a big part of the reason for that is because there aren't roles, especially for those juniors. In 2020, we had this massive industry growth. We saw 23% year over year growth from 2020 to 2021, but then growth that didn't keep up with inflation for every year since then. So we had this massive group of people who chased the dream, and then just didn't have roles to actually support that dream. So there is an appetite for whatever the hell I can get that will teach me how to make games and build my portfolio, I will do. From the students themselves, there's like a tremendous, like hungry appetite, like incredible effort. In my mind, I have a personal mentor who likes talking about us as rock stars, indie developers as rock stars. And I think that's the truth. Like these people are hungry, ready, and they are kind of pissed, it's revolution time. But on the other side, the more established studio side, the people with money side, I don't think there's the same appetite, unfortunately. There are people like us, it seems, who are like, man, we have to figure out how to like tap into this because this is clearly this massive creative potential. But then a lot of the money is really cautious at this point in time. And so they don't really put out that money. And then specifically for junior talent, the problem that we've run into a lot is junior talent strictly requires training wheels and therefore strictly requires time. So you might have an incredible senior and you might have even work for a couple of juniors to do, but you might not have the facility to support those juniors in the way that they need to do that work. And that ask is a lot bigger of an ask than just hiring a junior. I think we both know that. So I think like the short version of my answer is there is appetite, especially on the actual student or junior side. But where I've seen it mostly used is in moneyless solutions. So people starting volunteer studios, people starting rev share studios, people figuring out how to, who are just saying like, screw it, I'm going to do it myself, with or without money, self-funded studios, basically.
It's a very risk-averse market right now with studios. I mean, pretty much all of the ones that I've worked with or I'm talking to at the moment, they're circling the wagons, and they have been for the last few years, especially with the amount of layoffs. In some cases, companies are outsourcing a lot more to AI. So for me, from my perspective as kind of a third-party vendor in the recruiting space, I'm quite worried about how many opportunities there will be for junior level candidates over the next few years, because it's the competition has increased so much. I had an intermediate to senior level role a few months ago that I had lead to director candidates all applying for. And so we had this recruiting process where everyone was qualified to do the job. I had about 20 to 25 human beings all applying for it and then wondering why they weren't getting interviewed. And they're like, well, I've done this for the last 10, 15 years and I've done this. So I really do feel for people, particularly coming out of like a higher education system where they've spent, a lot of money learning fundamentals of game design, game art, or whatever. they're now entering a market and they're like, I literally can't get any work. So I think the solution of kind of that quote unquote outsourced kind of collaborative way of working, democratized, could work. I think where there could be great opportunities is if you find some of those studios that aren't just motivated by printing money, but they're the ones that are embedded in the games industry. They're trying to uplift things and they're championing, rights for developers, equity and equality of opportunities. I mean, those would be the people that I would be focusing for that, because sadly, I think this is a great idea, but you take it to some big studio with loads of dosh and they'll go, well,
we'll just use
why
AI.
would we take that risk? We'll just use AI, or we'll just hire like 5 seniors. And like, it's a very short-term way of thinking, because if we don't give the new bloods the opportunities, eventually our talent skills,
there's no seniors left,
kind of availability, it will atrophy, and it will become kind of a declining, aging population within games, and you need to kind of keep the newness coming in. So I think there's ways to do it. We just kind of have to be snipers about it.
You know what I have seen? I'll throw in this last thing. I think we're ranting now, but you've asked us a very good question. What I have seen is, in aggregate, the indie space is incredibly powerful right now because of this sort of movement that's happening. Individually, your chances of success are incredibly low, but in aggregate, there's so many people trying. What we have seen is a couple of studios that have succeeded. Aggro Crab is one of my favorites right now. Outer Sloth is one of my favorites right now. Inner Sloth is one of my favorites right now. And there's a couple of companies that have like released something that blew up, did well, and then they extended the ladder, and they're now creating more opportunities for indies. And I think that I hope is what happens over the next 5 years, that we sort of have this new wave of winners in the space that had to go through this period of little or no money, managed to break through, decided to open the doors as much as possible for those that followed.
Our hypothesis is, and again, this at this point really is a hypothesis, but it's the thing we're chasing, is that you're 100% right about a big studio. If they have money and they have defined methodologies, they have no reason to change it. They won't. But if you take that small indie studio that's got skill, they've got their shot, and they just frankly don't have enough money to deliver on the vision. Which is most, really small studios, that suddenly they become more open or interested in these other opportunities. And suddenly the ability to take your passionate community for the first version of the game that you built, and now you're building the sequel, or to invite them in to participate. It's a very different way of building a game, obviously, in the same way as proprietary software versus open source software, very different ways of building. It's not just a license. It's a totally different way of building. And again, I don't care about the license. I care about the way of building. But that way of building has overhead. It requires managing. It requires interfacing with these people who are contributing. In some cases, it requires then that mentorship, which is actually the beauty of it from a learning perspective. But the theory, at least, is that like open source software, which by the way has affected basically every single tech stack in the world, including LLMs, except for games, which I find shocking.
We've seen some.
We've seen some. Very, very limited though. Game engines, thank God, with Godot. Now it's becoming very promising. And so the ability to, I'll also add that one of the number one trends in games over the past 10, 15 years has been UGC. Has been, and obviously we see modding as just, this massive phenomenon, as an understatement. And so the ability to kind of take that next step of, it's not just UGC where they're taking a derivative of what we've created, but they're actually invited to help us create for a company that does not have the resources to create that thing. It allows them to build a better thing. It also allows them that to be their marketing value and build the community, so that and to get feedback along the way, so that when the game actually fully launches, it's been evolved by real feedback with the product, real data. So that's basically what we're trying to figure out. Is that right? And and my hypothesis is, it's not a question of is it right or not. It's more, how do you do it?
Yeah.
It lives in the layers of nuance around what really does it look like to do it well, and who does it benefit? Because it's certainly not everyone.
Yeah.
Anyway, I took a tangent from the audience,
it's
so I do
great.
want to make sure if you want to do that, we could do that.
Yeah, no, we'll wrap up here in a second, I think. I think this has just been a really good conversation, especially actually now. This feels very pertinent. The game industry is trying to figure out who and what it is, and I think we have started to see the next version of it, and I think it is in the hands of the indies. The past 2 years, an indie game wound up at least in contention for Game of the Year. And this year, 2025, an indie game won Game of the Year. And we've seen as well this dramatic increase in indie developers and this dramatic increase in a disenfranchisement with the typical pathways. More and more people are like, yeah, I'm just not going to bother. I'm going to do it myself. And that's been very exciting. So it's wonderful to see you in this space and trying to figure out this space. It's wonderful to see actors in this space trying to figure out this space. And there are more actors on a regular basis. And that, I think, is the part of this that's exciting and is the part that I hope people take into 2026. The traditional pathways are changing. And as a result, it can feel like there are no opportunities, but there are opportunities. They may just look different than what you expect or what they have been for the past 5 or 10 years. 5 or 10 years, that's like the whole lifespan of the game industry. So, I mean.
The cool thing about the game industry is it keeps changing so quickly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I saw one of the questions about AI, like, wow, okay, what's going to happen with AI in game making? All
Nobody
these
knows.
things, it's going to change.
Yeah.
And there are people who are going to find it, figure that out and have a good ride.
Yeah, I think so. We have a lot of good community questions here. I think for the sake of time, this will be our first episode without community questions. But I encourage everybody to continue to ask these questions and answer them for each other.
Can I answer one community question really quickly? I know you have to be done. And so,
all good.
But AI, AI. Those who know how to use AI are superhumans. Those who do not know how to use AI are going to soon be replaced by AI if they already haven't been. And so the question is, how do we teach literally the 3 billion kids under the age of 25 years old how to become power users of AI? And AI, and so that's the question facing humanity. That's a big one.
Yeah.
If you teach people these frontier tools, and the frontier tools change, it seems like, you could follow, X, and it's like by the week there are amazing new tools. It's so cool. If you just keep teaching what those frontier tools are, then people will become power users of those and be able to use the next round of frontier tools themselves. One of the other questions in there was, how do you stay up to date as these things change so quickly? And the answer is you just keep changing that, you keep evolving what you're teaching with, and then once people know how to use the basics, then they're running and they can be learning the next tool. So I just wanted to answer that before. So it doesn't have to be the only episode without community questions.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I'll echo that. I think it is we as the indie gaming space, we have a lot of pushback on AI because people are scared of it, which is reasonable. But my stance is largely it's Pandora's box. It's open. And if you try to shut Pandora's box, mostly all that happens is you fall behind. So I think we need to do our best to insist on ethical use of AI, to insist on ourselves using AI, to do things that make AI more reasonable. So like Itch is a beloved website for indie game developers, and they require you to disclose if AI was used in your game making. We can do things like that to make AI a little bit more reasonable. But I strongly encourage everybody to figure out how to incorporate AI into your workflow, because it is the next tool set. And the tool sets will keep changing and incorporating AI more. So yeah, figure out how to use it as effectively as you can. Let's also hopefully figure out how to not like boil off our water supply and all that fun consequences of AI. But yeah, mostly figure out how to use it well or fall behind, unfortunately. All right, I think that is going to wrap us up for the day. Before we go, we do like to do 2 different things here, Tim.
Yeah. So first of all, Matt, thank you for coming onto the show today. Is there anything that our listeners could potentially do over the course of the next week to apply what they've learned here today, or do a little bit of extra research? Where would you point them?
So endlessglobal.com is the website that gives kind of the overview of everything that we do, including the device and internet access. Endless Studios is our community that we literally haven't opened to people to come into yet. So it's a community that without a community, because yeah, I won't go into that tangent. But if you have any feedback, especially if you're kind of indie studio that is interested in what I just described, we haven't announced yet, but we are starting to do some investing in game studios that are interested in building this way. Feel free to email me at matt@endlessstudios.com.
You're going to get a couple
if you've
emails.
just got thoughts or feedback, I'd appreciate it.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah. Give a little bit of thought to Endless Studios and give some feedback. Wonderful that you open the doors for that. Before we go,
very much appreciate it.
100%. So before we go, Matt, is there anything you would like to promote or any last words of wisdom you'd like to leave us with here in the first episode of 2026?
I think the world ahead of us could be, if we don't figure out how to make people have jobs in a world of AI and you have mass unemployment, one of the worst versions of humanity we've ever seen. If we teach people how to become all superhumans and push the frontiers of science. Last night I was just talking to someone who's chasing a Nobel Prize in superconductivity, and like when AI gets applied to pushing the frontiers of human knowledge across every discipline, you have mass enabled that to literally the billions of people, like literacy. I think we have the best version of humanity, and I believe literally the difference between those two worlds comes down to games. Why? Because it's going to be teaching young people how to build software, and I think games are the best way to do that.
You're speaking to the right crowd for that message. Awesome. All right. I will also encourage anybody who is live here in the room with us. We're about to do our Indie Game Roundtable immediately after this in this same room, so I'll see you in there after the fact. But otherwise, I think, Tim, let's wrap up the episode and say goodbye.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Matt, thank you so much for having lunch with us here today. And thank you to those of you that asked some questions. And thank you for bearing with us because we did all gas on a little bit. And thank you, everyone else, for listening.
If you enjoyed it, there are links to join our Discord down below, as well as any of the links that we mentioned in this episode. And of course, here for Matt and for Endless in the description down below for those listening after the fact.
Yeah. Catch us next week at 12 p.m. EST. Follow the links that Willem mentioned, and we'll see you next time.
That's it. Goodbye for now, Indie Game Adventures. We'll see you again next week. Adios, y'all.
Fare thee well.
Goodbye. All right. Well, well, well. Back here instantly. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hi, SuperDev. Hi, Solomon. Hi, Arwen. Hi, Rowan. Hi, Allie. Hi, Scott. Hi, Wesley. Hi, Tim. Tim, do you want to just be on stage? You want to come back on stage? Oh, am I muted? Can y'all hear me? Question mark, question mark. I've lost my channel. Oh, can't hear. 1 second. I don't know why you can't hear me. 1 second, I'm gonna reload. Oh, also, for those who are watching the stream, goodbye. We love you. Adios.